Real Talk USA.
It's my house, come on, turn it up.
The hour where the U.S. mission to the African Union comes to you through Afro FM 105.3 to highlight the United States partnership in Africa. Current issues will be discussed. Guests will engage on a variety of topics, ranging from politics to jazz. Co-hosted by EUL Solomon of Afro FM and Chris Mead of USAU. The show will air every Thursday. Feel free to participate by sending messages to the USAU social media sites www.usau.usmission.gov or www.facebook.com/USAU and follow USAU on twitter.com/USAU.
Just relax. Welcome to my house.
Real Talk USA.
Welcome to my house. It's my house.
Hello everyone, this is our weekly show Real Talk USA on 105.3 Afro FM, and it's me, EUL Solomon, with Ms. Gawat Addis. Hi.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Mez, and I'm here today with Meg Riggs, who is working with the U.S. Embassy here in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. This week marks the last week of March, Women's History Month, and we would like to dedicate our show today on International Gender Champions. I would like to give the floor to Meg. Meg, welcome. Thank you for being on the show.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Please say a little bit about yourself first, and then we can move on to the issue at hand.
Absolutely. So, as you said, my name is Meg Riggs. I'm currently one of the political officers at the U.S. Embassy to Ethiopia right now. But in my previous position, my previous post, I was at the U.S. delegation to the United Nations in Geneva. And soon after I got there, I had the opportunity to be part of the team that built the International Gender Champions and was working kind of at the research phase, like what do we do, how do we do it, and then the build-out phase, how do we make this work and be pliable so it's really useful. And it was really hard to leave this project that had kind of gained real momentum, but in the Foreign Service we move on every 3 years, and so but it was a joy to arrive in Ethiopia as well.
Thank you. Okay, for the sake of clarity, what is the International Gender Champion? Like, what is the initiative?
Right.
Tell us a little bit about the program.
All right. So the International Gender Champions was originally the Geneva Gender Champions, and then when UN Secretary General Guterres moved from Geneva to New York, he said we need to make this happen UN wide. And so it became the International Gender Champions, and we changed the branding everywhere through. And then once New York joined us, so did Vienna. And then soon after that, we just recently, for International Women's Day this year, Nairobi joined.
Yes.
So you now have UN communities around the world that have joined this initiative. The goal is leaders. It has to be the leadership taking personal responsibility to orchestrate change within their institutions to ensure equal representation of gender within the programs they're running. And that was done very specifically. We really spent a lot of time debating, should it be done at the working level? Do you make a grand strategy plan? And the answer was, there's already 1 million grand strategy plans that have been written that are these pie in the sky, this would be the ideal world. What was missing were like the concrete baby steps that moved you in the direction of these other overarching visions. And you've got the Millennium Development Goals, you've got now the Sustainable Development Goals, it's in there. But what are the steps you have to take to actually get there? And realizing that everyone comes to this question from a very different place. And so how do you, if you're the United States, you're having different questions than you're having if you're Sierra Leone, and you're having if you're in Kenya or in, Singapore. And so come as you are, look at what you want to do within the organization that you are in, and then think through literally concrete, achievable, we call them SMART goals, like specific, measured. You can find these over time with the goal that within a year you could say, check, we've done this piece, and then the champions would commit to set new targets and to not make them too big, because then they're not achievable. And so really focusing on the baby steps. And so we started in Geneva. It was ambassadors. literally in the beginning, it was recruiting kind of one by one. Will you become a champion with us? I should back up a little bit. We had a new American ambassador that arrived.
Okay.
She really wanted to make a difference, but also really didn't want to duplicate efforts. She didn't want to waste people's time. And so we spent 6 months going around and talking to all the different stakeholders from within the UN secretariats, within the other embassies, within the NGOs who were very active. At the time, people like IOM, who's now part of the UN family, but that was happening in that time period. But other just NGOs that operate out of Geneva globally, what is it that they need? What would be useful? What's a value add? And so at the end of that kind of studying period, it distilled down into something that was the Gender Champions. We then thought, we spent a lot of time in, what we tried to do is make it an evolving organization. And so we had an idea of where we wanted to go and what we thought the targets would be, but we tried to stay really open-minded in the first couple of years about what was working and what wasn't, and not waste time on the things that weren't gaining traction, and then things that surprised you, like, oh, there's actually a lot of interest over here, so let's adapt and adjust. And so even though the US was maybe the catalyst to the conversation, we really invested in, it has to come from the multilateral community that was there, and it has to be organic to what their needs were. And then when New York came on, we had to rethink it again, right? New York had very different dynamics, very different needs, and so we didn't want to assume that worked in Geneva would work. And so we've tried to, with each new group that has joined, make sure that the core principles are there, but that each community could kind of set the targets that work for that community. And so having enough of a kind of a true north, as we say, but enough flexibility that it really worked with wherever you're at. And some of the true north items was that every champion had to make 3 kind of concrete small baby steps for the year ahead that they would work on.
Okay.
They would have to agree to not be on an all-gendered panel.
Yes.
And in multilateral fora, panels are everything, right? Everything happens via panel.
Panels.
And so how do you make those panels more representative of the whole? And what we found was there were really qualified women in any sector you could think of. But we all, as humans, tend to call the people who we know, who we've worked with closely, who are our buddies. And so panels on women tended to be all women, which is also not productive. And panels on telecommunications were pretty much all men. And so how do we, over time, change that and understand that there are other people out there? And so that was kind of these core things. People have to agree to these core items and really represent that. And then as we went on, we actually said, like, we want everyone to go out and do a really great speech on this. Like, find a place where you can actually talk about this in a public space to help move the conversation globally. And so, like, we've talked to the champions about what we need them to do personally. And then they've all had to come up with teams who would help them move that agenda along. So
that's very interesting. And I'm assuming most of these champions are at a leadership level, management level, and they are the ones that craft or shape the way they want their organizations or the community that they're leading focus on the diversity of the group.
Correct. It had to literally be the head of UNHCR.
Okay.
It had to be the head of IOM. It had to be the ambassador. It had to be the president or like director general of a particular NGO. And so it was specific, and we really grappled with that over time. Like, wouldn't it be easier if we took it down to a lower level? But then when we realized you lost the momentum. It really takes leadership to decide. And the thing that reaffirmed that it takes leadership is in the first 18 months, the biggest challenge were their like under secretaries, their deputy level, that next layer right under them, weren't necessarily like, so their staff were leaning in and the leadership was leaning in, and we were actually finding that middle management was actually some of our challenges. And so working in year 2 to decide what kinds of targets and goals do you set to adjust that particular gatekeeper, and how do you do that in a way that was productive? And that was something that we didn't anticipate going in.
So just go to the top.
Went to the top, and then you had the bottom, and then together you kind of
push things forward.
Yeah.
Interesting. Before we started the show, we were talking about some of the challenges that were faced by organizations or communities because there were people who, for example, let's take the issue of recruitment.
Yes.
Recruitment was. The idea was that women were not applying to things,
right.
But then again, they were just not being taken in. So, right. Can you say a little bit more about some of the issues that you discovered when you were trying to make these things
Sure.
happen?
The first thing we did was look back at the last set of like 12, 13 years of data, because in 13 years earlier, the UN had decided they would start actually collecting the data on who they were hiring by gender, which hadn't been done before. And at first, because it was a big issue, there had been an uptick. But then slowly over time, those numbers had gone down. And also, if you looked at the overall data, it looked in general like women were like 40%. Mm-hmm. But what we found was at the lower ranks, they were like 80. Mm-hmm. And at the top ranks, the higher you got, the more they disappeared. And so they were entering, they weren't staying. And so one of the questions is, why weren't they being promoted? Or what were those things that were going forward in that regard? And then in other cases, women just weren't applying at all. Mm-hmm. And so figuring out what were the things that were standing in the way. And so we actually created impact groups, not working groups, because that has a very specific workload assumption within UN systems. So we had to come up with our own name for them. And since the point was impact, we focused on the impact. And some of those groups found that there really wasn't something there to move along. Mm-hmm. And then others found things that we didn't even understand. Delegations. Mm-hmm. So for you to be considered at the highest levels within UN, at some point you probably needed to be a chair or a vice chair of an important working group. Mm. But if you didn't come on a delegation from your country, then you weren't even in the running to be considered for a chair or a vice chair, to then gain the reputation and the kind of rapport with your colleagues to be considered for one of those director level jobs. And so they did this huge study to figure out what was going on with that and what would be the incentives to create more balanced delegations. Some countries did a great job, others did a terrible job. And what's interesting is each UN entity had its own subculture about how comfortable they were with trying to influence the member states to shape their delegations. So the Parliamentarian Union was really comfortable with it. And they came up with all these incentives to make it a challenge if you didn't bring a diverse delegation. And they even penalized one delegation that was all women. Because the point was not to go from all one to all the other. The point was this diverse group. Yeah. And so they really leaned into, we're going to really incentivize and decentivize people being diverse in the delegations that they send, and then make sure that the chairs and the vice chairs are given kind of equal opportunities. There were other organizations who were like, we could never tell the member states what to do. Yeah. And then when you realize that that's the culture of that particular UN organization, working with the member states to say, could you place pressure on your fellow ambassador colleagues to put pressure on their capitals to be more mindful about who they sent in delegations to big meetings? And so if the UN Secretariat couldn't do it, could the member states do it? Could we as friends say, hey, I noticed you brought an all-male delegation to this particular specialty. Could you bring some women next time? How about some young women who are up and coming, some interns who could grow over time? Like, it doesn't have to be immediate. Yeah. You just have to set into process that it could change. And so it was just finding ways. And so what they realized were for the upper level positions, the big stumbling block was the delegations themselves. Yeah. And so working with member states to think more mindfully about how they construct their, but we didn't know that going in. On hiring, we realized, I will use an example because they've been very public about it. ICRC realized that they had kind of invisible criteria in what was required to be in senior positions within ICRC. Okay. And it took the leader of it himself looking at it to realize, oh, that isn't actually necessary to do the job we're asking of you, but it was tripping up women being eligible for those jobs in the first place. And so rethinking what were the criteria that you need to get the right kind of candidate that doesn't trip up a certain segment by accident. And he was really forthcoming about it. Like in his first 6-month review, this is what we found. We had no idea we're working to fix that. And so those are those like little baby steps. And then once you fixed it, okay, what's the next thing that seems to be holding things up? Whether that's, lactation rooms in conference spaces. So if you had to come with a baby, you could do something about that. Like there are things you can do to make it easier for women over the course of their career to stay engaged. They're baby steps, but they make a big difference to the individual woman at that time.
True. And all it takes sometimes is just taking a close look at what is, a set standard that has been working for the past 50 years and could change now that things are different.
Right.
That is so interesting. And as I was saying earlier in my conversations with you, I had thought that especially gender parity was more an issue in third world countries than in, places like Geneva, the UN, where you would think things are more equal in terms of gender. But, doing research for this conversation, I found out that it's actually very, still something of an issue there as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
In 2015, overall gender representation within the UN system was still 29% women and 70+% men. And that's actually up from where it had been a few years earlier. It's one of those things that if we don't stay mindful about it, it actually falls back into our habits versus what it is that we want to achieve. One example that was given to me in the human rights context was that the human rights dialogues, like at the Human Rights Council and others, often focus on prisoner conditions. And one woman pointed out that we've never actually put into law that if a woman in prison is in labor, she shouldn't be shackled. And that they actually have indications that happens in a lot of places. But because you had predominantly men working in those spaces, and you're thinking about political prisoners and different kinds of things, you hadn't thought through what are those kind of, that margin of experience that would only be held by women, that maybe that you actually have to be explicit about the fact of how do you treat a woman who is pregnant while she's in prison. And to me that's unthinkable, but the reality is it has been happening. And the UN kind of rights community, the women's community within that, have been advocating for that to be kind of a bare minimum.
At least,
you would think that that's an obvious, but maybe not.
Sometimes if the rules don't exist, they are open for people in authority to interpret. So
exactly.
it's difficult for it might differ from one place to another.
What I loved about the journey of the gender champions was I kept thinking about everything that we were learning about making spaces equal would impact any group that was left out. So for those with handicaps, like those, I know in some countries this is complicated, but LGTB. Like when you think about making things genuinely fair and doing a better job of recruiting and looking at it and making it diverse, by making it diverse, you will actually make it more welcoming to everybody in the space. And you have better outcomes.
Exactly. And sorry to cut you off, but I wanted you to talk about the experience you had, actually the challenge you had in bringing in one of the ambassadors into the group that you were trying to organize,
right? And
how that brought issues to the table that were not there to begin with, because that certain person was not there to bring them on.
Exactly. So one of the things that we noticed when we were looking at the ambassadors who had signed up for the Gender Champions was they were mostly men. And you're like, wait a minute, where are all the women? And so it made me actually go count all the ambassadors in Geneva by gender. And you realize that the majority of them were men. And so it makes sense that the majority of the champions that are there would also be men, that it was reflective of the total pool. But we were also looking at things from a regional, because the UN focuses on the different regions. Do we have adequate representation from Asia, Latin America, Africa? And what we saw, interestingly, was that there was a larger percentage of African women ambassadors in Geneva than the other regions could take credit for. But they were not present. And so we went to find out what was holding them back from joining our initiative. And their concern was that we wouldn't be furthering issues that were important to them, and that they were very busy and very active in the community, and they didn't want to be distracted from achieving their own goals. totally valid. But then we kind of postured, if you're not here, we won't even know the goals that should be achieved because it's not obvious to us, and we need you in the conversation. And these group of ambassadors who have joined are very committed to this. And so you have kind of an army that are ready to do your work because they genuinely care about this issue. And so they took a risk and joined us. One of those is now on the global board. They were able to help us really focus on the kinds of key issues that were getting in the way, like the delegations. How do you make sure, okay, the ambassador is a woman, but if the whole delegation that comes to, each meeting, and there's hundreds of meetings in a week, let alone over the course of a year by various delegations, then how do you help that happen? How do you make sure internships happen? Doing internships in Geneva was very difficult. It was very expensive to do. There weren't always the resources available. So if you were a kind of young African woman, quite possibly you wouldn't have had the resources to come and do that. And so she really cared about how do we make those internships exist and make them possible. And so people pitched in to try to figure out how do we make those kinds of opportunities happen. And so representation of everyone matters. And the UN is designed to make sure that the countries are equally represented, but it's now about all those other parts of make us whole. And I really hoped that what we did with the gender champions benefited everyone, not just one group. And we didn't say women champions, we said gender on purpose.
Yes.
We all have one. We wanted the men to be part of it. And the data really shows that if men aren't part of it, we won't actually solve the problem. And so we were really specific about wanting men to be the champions. And they've done a lot of really great work.
Wonderful.
What are some of the major results that you've achieved through this process and initiative?
That's a great question. So I think one is representation. Never undervalue the point of representation. So when you go and you look at panels today, the difference, we actually track the data on panels. And what the Director General realized, Michael Mueller, was that by just saying, hey, there's no women on this panel, magically really talented women showed up. And people were like, I'm not speaking if this doesn't kind of represent the whole. We started getting these experts to be able to put on their resume, I spoke at this UN panel as an expert on this or that. And never underestimate that being on your resume is kind of giving you credence for future jobs that you're looking for. And so genuinely changing the face of who gets to be the experts in a town that is all about the weeds on any topic you can think of. Where New York is very political in some ways, Geneva is a town full of geeks. That's why I love them. And think of any issue from why your cell phone works and how satellites move across to nuclear physics to intellectual property. It's all happening there. And making sure women are presented in those spaces. And that's, I think, a really big piece. 2, we started looking very carefully at how hiring was done and what was missing in the solicitation for people being hired. And then beyond just what was in the solicitation, were we going to where women were? So one expert that we relied on was a woman named Iris Bonet. She's at Harvard's Business School. She has a book called What Works? And she has done extensive research in the private sector as to why women are or are not thriving in various private sector spaces, particularly at the CEO and higher levels. And when we looked at those findings, those things that we're doing, we realized, we're making some of these same mistakes in the UN space. So could we apply those lessons from the private sector to the UN spaces? And one of them is about what it takes to get a qualified woman, and I would argue even a really qualified, well-rounded man, to take some of these hard jobs. One of the things that we've talked a lot about is you want people who care about their teams, who can set a vision of where they're going, who really can lead where they're going. But too often what we get are people who are not as in tuned to what the group around them needs to thrive. Part of it is the kind of people who make a split-second decision, I'm going, my family's following, this is what's happening, are often the first people to take the job. But that instinct of my family will follow is also not necessarily connected to taking care of your team. And so the kinds of men and women who would say, that's a really great offer, but I need to consult with my family, I need to consult with my community, will also be the kind of person who will do that as a leader. But sometimes they're a little slower on the take. And then we move over because we're moving too quickly. And so really, if you really want a qualified woman, you're probably going to have to ask her a couple times. And that's okay. And so realizing that in that recruitment phase, there's always been this idea that, well, if they're hungry, they'll come. And the reality is you're best qualified not be coming because they're seeing how there's actually a lot of things that might make other parts of their life suffer. And that they needed to be well-rounded. And that they're going to be a really well-rounded leader, but you need to be able to kind of get over that efficiency, they put it in air quotes, hurdle, in order to get the people who really can make a difference in that space. So that's kind of that trade-off.
Okay. I was thinking yesterday, why Geneva? But now I understand exactly why it started in Geneva and it took in Geneva, because, as you said, most other places have what you would call their niche, be it political, be it social, but the weeds, as you said, are in Geneva.
Right.
Like
the day-to-day work of policy
exactly.
and programming and how do you make it all connect?
Yeah, I was thinking why, and then, but now I understand.
We also had an ambassador who was really passionate about this issue, and really wanted to make sure that we had a positive impact in the space. And so it does take a leader saying, I really want to go in this direction. And one of the tools that we used to understand what the needs were salons. And so it was doing catalytic questioning, using a huge group, 100 people that were from key places within Geneva, to talk about how do we really move this needle forward. And one of the suggestions was that we need a network of some sort, like people who are really committed, that can work together, that can make commitments together, hold each other accountable. And the salon ended and everyone left. And after a couple weeks, we thought, that really didn't work. And they're like, all right, maybe we need to jigger. And then 8 weeks later, the head of the UN in Geneva, Michael Mueller, circled back and said, my staff can't stop talking about this. I think we should do something. And so sometimes it's a matter of just actually 8 weeks is not a long time for a seed to germinate.
Yeah.
But we were, we wanted it done yesterday. But in hindsight, it was actually probably a really natural evolution. Like it created a conversation. We had already been going around creating conversations. And then within 6 weeks, we did the initial launch and asked everybody to make commitments, take 3 months to think about it. But by this date, we would like to see the changes you're committing to make. We'd like to see your panel pledge that you won't be on an all-male panel again, or an all-women panel. And that you would join us in kind of moving this forward. And people quickly kind of galvanized. And one of the first people who signed up was Guterres. He was the head of UNHCR. And so again, it's leadership saying, I think we're onto something here. And then beyond just those surface commitments, the impact groups, the people at the ground level who were going through the data, collecting the data, trying to figure out where there's something that we're not seeing, realizing the delegations were this key that we hadn't unlocked, that we didn't know and needed to be adjusted. That came out of one of the impact groups. That wasn't their goal, but that's what they found. Looking at whether or not hiring really was kind of open and fair. And then when it came down to it, were we hiring our buddy or were we hiring the most qualified person? And then holding each other accountable as we kind of move through that journey. There's now over 200 champions. I remember when we celebrated when we hit 100 in Geneva. That was a really big deal for us. And then we wanted to stay above 100 because people rotate out.
Yes.
And so you have to recruit the next ambassador coming in. And so how do you make sure that it stays living and that it's useful to everybody? But the real key, in my mind, is that it quickly was no longer a U.S. initiative, but it was a UN community initiative. And that at the time we had a tripartite. So the ambassadors, so the member states, the UN heads of agencies, and then the heads of the NGO sector that was in Geneva. And there's a lot of big international NGOs that are headquartered there. And there's something, there's things NGOs can say that the other two can't. There's things the UN can say that the member states can't. There's things that the member states, and so there's this sometimes tense, but really productive push and pull between these three actors who have different restrictions and different liberties.
Yes.
And so the ability to kind of push each other, it's like three legs of a stool that allowed it to grow, and then making sure that whatever we were spending our time on was worth it for the outcomes that we were getting. And knowing when, this isn't going anywhere, so maybe we should adjust and move somewhere else. And then in year 2, really thinking beyond some of those first findings, but what were the challenges in certain sectors? So trade was a big issue. And so Arantxa Gonzalez, who is the head of the International Trade Center, which is helping kind of developing countries who want to engage at WTO in a more productive, constructive way, and helping like women businesses and others, and getting the head of WTO and others to come together and say, you know what, there's a nexus here about really making sure that the trade conversation understands how gender fits into it. Until that first year of GGC, there'd never been a report on how trade impacts gender out of WTO.
Wow.
Now there is one every 2 years. And so really looking at the data, what are the examples? How does this work? Where does this go? And when we first proposed it, people were like, really? I mean, this is trade. Right, but women are 50% of business, right? Like, so how do we do that? How do we understand where there might be challenges? What are the hang-ups that are specific to women? Like if you have to have a deed, and some countries don't give it women property of land, does that hold them up? Could there be another criteria? Like thinking through the kinds of things that get in the way, trying to remove all these trade barriers, but are there hidden barriers to women in trade that we aren't including? Because often we go, well, let's go for the thing that works for everyone. Well, I think we've kind of reached the point where we've done that. Yeah. And so now we need to look at the next layer of what's not working for some groups unfairly. And I think we're there at a point as an international community where it's time for that question.
True.
But International Gender Champions lives and breathes today, 3-4 years later, because it is a multilateral, everyone has a piece of it, everyone owns a piece of it. And they're all working to shape where it goes versus just one member state who had a vision. It wouldn't have lasted if it was just an American vision.
Yeah.
And so really getting buy-in from others, letting go of the reins a little bit and letting others help shape it, which isn't always easy. But yeah, that was the key to it.
Do you think international gender champions can serve as a model to take in, at a national level, let's say, for example, in a country or in a REC, the regional economic communities that are present in different continents and different regions? And do you think it's worthwhile to see that happening, or do you think the International Gender Champion, as it stands now at the UN level, is enough to change some of the obstacles that are present?
It's never enough. And I know as I was leaving, there was a real talk about how could you do it in particular sectors. So in the IT sector, or could you do it in ag? And so there's a genuine, maybe it's changed since I've left, but when I left there was a genuine feeling that every sector could. And so whether that's, SADC or, ECOWAS or whatever that is, there's room for those communities to decide. And what I like the best about this, and we worked really hard to build this in, is SADC or the African Union could decide for themselves what those criteria are. I mean, they'd have to have the panel pledge. They've got to figure out how they're going to get women to the table. And they have to come up with commitments. But the goal isn't to prescribe those commitments. And the other thing that I would caution people against is, one, getting into the big kind of visionary thing again, like that those visions exist. If they don't create a policy, the UN office in Geneva realized going in, they didn't actually have a gender policy. And so their first commitment, first out of the gates, was, we need to create a policy. What is our standard here? Some people realized they had no training involved, and so could they build training units? And so sometimes just making the commitment to look at what you've got and don't is a good first step.
True, because you might even assume the UN being, a very diverse space, probably would have had.
They were shocked. They had no idea. You also reach a certain point, it's 2015. Doesn't this exist? Oh wait, it didn't. And so, assuming it's there, taking stock, step one, and then two, take really baby steps. We're not trying to be flip about this. You don't have to change it all overnight. You just need to find those kind of shifts in the machinery that would allow the production to work more efficiently. and realizing where those hang-ups might be along your assembly line, and going in and making those kind of targeted adjustments. I also worry, because there was initially an instinct of everyone's pet project. So whether that's market women or whether that's this, like they kind of get too focused on a particular niche. Those NGOs exist. Those programs are happening. It could become an incentive for a particular state if that's their next step. But as the organization as a whole, the goal is don't just get people setting targets and meeting them, and then meet them over time instead of trying to make sure every pet project gets into something bigger, because then that takes over the overall conversation. And so letting member states, letting organizations kind of just mindfully set annual targets, do an annual analysis, and then set the next targets as they go forward. Because I think you can get lost into either the big clouds or the tiny weeds. And what you want to do is stay at the tactical, kind of institutional. How do you make the institution fair and equal, the way we all assume they are, but in fact sometimes they're not.
Anything you would like to say, particularly addressing Women's History Month? Anything in your background that you want to share in terms of this particular theme, if you'd like?
I think what's interesting is I never started thinking I would be like a gender expert. I never dreamed that would kind of become the thing. But what's interesting is I went to a women's college in the United States because feminism had been a bad word where I grew up. It was the F word. And I always thought, like, how is this thing about me being equal so bad? And so at 18, against probably my father's wishes, ran off to a women's college to find out what this feminism thing was all about, and then realized it's really about equality. And that often when people disparage the word feminism, what they're trying to do is silence the group who's asking for equality again, and we have to get past that. And so I give real credit to Wheaton College, who really gave me my kind of deep feminist creds and gave me a sense of the history of where we've come from, and that as a woman today, I stand on the shoulders of amazing women who've done much more daring and life-threatening things. And I've really put it all out there so that we can talk about literally tweaks to the assembly line at this point in history, and I'm kind of humbled by that continuum, right? But then everywhere I've served, women's issues have been a really important piece all over the world. My first overseas assignment was the Republic of Georgia, and after the Soviet Union had collapsed, the women went and got jobs to feed their kids, and weirdly had gotten the new kinds of market skills they needed to be employable at the time. And unfortunately, a lot of the men waited for the factories to come back, waited for the industry they had known to return. But then that disharmony created real social challenges that hurt families, hurt women, hurt men. And so kind of leaving there realizing, like, okay, however you make these adjustments, you've got to think about communities as a whole without holding back women, because that's the tradition. Liberia, I arrived just as the elections were happening for Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, and the market women had done it. And I arrived just in awe of these women who had fought for peace, who had fought for a woman who would usher them through this transition, which isn't perfect, but nothing is.
True.
And to see how these women were literally taking charge and rebuilding their country from scratch, the devastation was hard to explain. And they rebuilt it. And they rebuilt it with the men as well, but like, they really were changing the course of the country by empowering 100% of their people versus just 50. And I think that will always be the experience that really, truly, I always said I kind of grew up in Liberia. Like, that was where I came of age in a way. And I am very appreciative of the women who allowed me to just pitch in alongside them. And we created things there like the Women's Chamber of Commerce. And it came up out of a DVC that the embassy had done on women in business. And at the time, the rule was that only Liberians could sell rice. It was like a protected industry. And it came up in the conversation that none of the women did it because only Liberians could do it. And I kind of brashly, as a young American woman, was like, aren't you Liberians? Right. And I was like, so you're assuming Liberian men. Does the rule say men? And like, no. Oh. We could be selling rice. Like, it was like this moment of like, oh, wait a minute, it doesn't actually exclude us on paper, but the culture had. And then over time, like, what could we do to help you get there? And By the time I left 3 years after this initial conversation, the Women's Chamber of Commerce was a force to be reckoned with. And I can't take credit other than I said, here's a library, use it. Like, do your research, use the space for your meetings until you've got something else you can do. Like, we are here to provide a platform. And they're amazing. They're doing amazing stuff. And then in Burkina, the women in Burkina really figured out how that there was a shift happening within the predominant Muslim community that the government was oblivious to, but they were seeing it within their kids. And they came in and said, we need data to show that there's a change afoot. Help us collect that data. And so getting them grant money to go and show where schools weren't meeting the needs. How do they make it happen? Where were the schools happening? What was the curriculum? Where could they go? And they could show up to the Ministry of Education with real data that show, like, here are our concerns. Here's the data that backs that. How do we work together to fix this? They did all the work, but it's such a privilege to kind of hear their stories, figure out how do I get you resources, and see where they could take that piece. And so Switzerland has the highest number of PhD and highly educated women in the world that are unemployed. Because the systems in Switzerland don't support a working mom. And that was probably my hardest assignment ever, because my husband and I both were working. And the stores aren't open after work hours, and they send kids home for lunch. And so where do you go? And so there were all these kind of, and they're like, well, it's our culture. And there's this interesting tension of cultural preservation that equates to women not being freed up to do other things. And as a cultural officer, typically, cultural preservation matters to me. That's protecting a beautiful old church. That's music and food and rich family relationships. But we have to be circumspect about preservation that is really about caste. Right? And so how do you understand where culture and respect overlap too much with holding down a particular group? And that's not just women. That's writ large. And so I think that these kinds of initiatives really allow you to look at the systems in place, realize the barriers that had been invisible, and create a concrete path to fix that. And hopefully keep the thing that matters about your culture while also allowing kind of more diversity of thought and opinion to shape the world we'll live in. And at a time like now, we need the UN more than ever. And we need these communities to bring us together and find peaceful outcomes for hard topics.
True. Thank you very much, Meg. It's been a pleasure having you on Real Talk USA. One more thing that we'd like to address, perhaps, is women in the workplace and their way forward. If you want to say something about that.
Sure. I think what's interesting is how workplace culture has to shift in this. And it's that kind of, that thing that people are uncomfortable about talking about. But inevitably, when you bring in a new group, the overall picture does change. And the research on this is really interesting. And you have to understand how group dynamics form. When one person comes in from someone who's different than the majority, they're usually seen as a rock star. And the data on this is unfortunately really clear and surprising and not at the same time. If you're someone different in that space, say it's an all black space and the white person came in, then they must be really great at what they do. You must be above the average of us to be here. And so actually they show, like, through evaluations and things, they get extra credit than they maybe even merited. Because there's this perception of the one is somehow amazing. Once there's two, in fact, the reviews for those people both diminish below their actual performance. You no longer have this special status, and you just make the homogeny culture feel uncomfortable. And so there's this weird line of where do you hit that tipping point where you've created something new that's really critical. And somewhere around 30%, some studies said like 28, some people said 33, but like 30-ish, which is why we actually said that panels and things like that, 30-ish either way is important. Once you cross the threshold of 30%, generalizing, you create a new culture that is diverse, and people can be individuals in that culture and no longer representatives of their respective group. which is an interesting thing. Like, you're no longer the token X. You actually are an individual. You're Sarah, you're George, you're whatever in this group. But the majority indicate in surveys that they feel like they've been pushed out once the minorities hit 30%. You're still
70%.
but there's a sense of being pushed out. But what it is the culture is lost. That thing that made you all feel collective is no longer the thing that binds. Something new does. And so I think as leaders, acknowledging that there's this magic thing that happens at 30% and thinking about how to lead your teams through that threshold and create a new joint unity that everyone sees themselves in versus the old one, and acknowledge that the group who had an old culture are going to probably mourn the loss of that culture. And that matters for nations, that matters for organizations. And so thinking as countries, as spaces become more diverse and you cross that threshold, the group who had a distinct culture no longer have it as such. And so finding a way to talk about that in a productive way within your team, within your organization, is a really important piece, because you can do all this recruiting to get everybody in the room. But then once everybody's there, you have something new, and you have to be mindful of the fact that it's something new. And create new ways to talk about it. And so that's it's a challenge that if you ignore it, then people go, oh, this is just uncomfortable, let's go back to the way it was, which isn't really the option anymore. And so how do you think about creating a new narrative, a new norm, a new culture that everyone feels part of, that isn't based on the things that bound everybody together before? And there's really great research on bullying. So it always had been done from the perspective of the kid being bullied, or like the bully being someone who is an outsider. But in fact, usually it's groups that bully, and that groups will define themselves by some form of characteristic that binds them together, whether that's color, whether that's their IQ, whether that's their talent in a particular thing. And when someone enters that doesn't match subconsciously what the group has decided brings them together, there's this instinct to push away because it feels like it's threatening the thread that ties them together. And so we do it instinctively. Kids do it on the playground. They do it, like we learn it at a very basic level. And so as we move forward, and bullying in the workplace is unfortunately a real thing that often pushes really talented people out the door. And so finding ways to create a new set of criteria that binds to kind of alleviate that tension that's there, that I think before we just thought, oh, they're adults, they'll sort it out. But actually the research shows that as an organization, you can create a new culture if you do it proactively and mindfully that actually brings everybody together. But you can't just assume it will happen, because as humans, unfortunately, it's not our strong suit.
Anything you would like to add?
No, just thank you for letting me join you. This was amazing.
Thank you so much. It was very insightful. It was, for me, it informed me about a whole set of issues that I was not aware of. I tried to read up before this conversation, and it's fascinating, the information that's out there.
And you can go to www.genderchampions.com and learn everything you want to see. Check out the champions, their commitments. There's a ton of resources there.
Fantastic.
Thank you very much.
No, thank you.
Real Talk USA.
It's my house, come on, turn it up.
The hour where the U.S. mission to the African Union comes to you through Afro FM 105.3 to highlight the United States partnership in Africa. Current issues will be discussed. Guests will engage on a variety of topics, ranging from politics to jazz. Co-hosted by EUL Solomon of Afro FM and Chris Mead of USAU. The show will air every Thursday. Feel free to participate by sending messages to the USAU social media sites www.usau.usmission.gov or www.facebook.com/USAU and follow USAU on twitter.com/USAU.
Just relax. Welcome to my house.
Real Talk USA.
Welcome to my house. It's my house.